The economic, political, and cultural institutions and ideas of modern European societies, as described in the last two chapters, spread steadily across much of the world after about 1870. The large European nation states, which were now equipped with the overwhelming new powers of science and industry, gained empires for themselves throughout the globe. The history of Europe became more closely involved than ever before in the interconnected history of the whole world. For a while, the most active of the imperialist nation states were located in Europe, and the 40 years preceding the First World War can therefore be described as the era of Europe's most far-reaching global power and influence. With the rise of the United States, the term Western came into use, signifying European cultures in an expanded sense. The rapid economic development of Japan made the term Western an inappropriate description for many aspects of modernity or modernization, as did other later developments in the cultures and societies outside of Europe. Modernizing social changes were transforming almost all parts of the world by the early 20th century. Somewhat later, in the decades after 1950, Europeans and other social analysts around the globe began to speak of developed countries, in comparison with which many regions were seen as less developed or developing. There also came to be a broad category of nations that constituted a so-called Third World. This diffuse Third World had no specific geographical identity, but the term referred to developing countries that were outside the European American and Soviet Russian spheres of direct influence during the geopolitical conflicts of the later 20th century. All such terms were somewhat imprecise, but they represented efforts to deal with the same complex historical reality, namely a bifurcation between modern and developing societies, or between rich 657 countries and poor ones, or between industrialized and less industrialized nations, or between powerful economies and weak economies. On 1165, the Third World. For the first time in human history, by 1900, it was possible to speak of a world civilization. Although always retaining important differences in languages, culture, and social practices, all countries were increasingly drawn into a world economy and a world market. The attributes of political and economic modernity were much the same everywhere: modern science, modern weapons of warfare, machine industry, fast communications, public education, efficient taxation and law enforcement, and modern public health, sanitation, and medicine. But not all peoples participated in this global evolution on equal terms. It was the Europeans, or those who were rapidly building European-style industrial economies on other continents, who reaped the greatest rewards. Elsewhere, small tribal or regional societies and massive old civilizations alike began to come apart, reacting to the pressures of modern economic and social changes. Scientific ideas changed ways of thinking everywhere, as they had in Europe. In India, China, or Africa, local industries often suffered, and many people found it harder than ever to subsist even at a low level within the new global system. The building of railways in China, for example, threw boatmen, carters, and innkeepers out of work. In India, the hand spinners and weavers of cotton could not compete in their own villages with the machine-made products of Lancashire. In parts of Africa, tribal groups that had lived by owning herds of cattle, moving from place to place to obtain grazing lands, found European farmers or plantation owners or mine companies occupying their country and using European colonial laws to make them give up their migratory habits. Peoples of all races began to produce commodities for export: rubber, raw cotton, jute, petroleum, tin, gold, which exposed both workers and merchants to the rise and fall of world prices. A depression in one part of the global economy tended to become a world depression, dragging all down alike. Imperialism, or the European colonialism of the late 19th century, may be somewhat narrowly defined as the government of one people by another. As a specific form of political control, European 1166 imperialism proved to be transitory, weakening and disappearing in this form after the Second World War. But the broader economic and cultural aspects of the colonial systems continued to influence post-colonial societies long after they regained their political independence. Imperialism and empire building became a new 19th century phase in the worldwide spread of the industrial and scientific civilization that had originated in Europe's inner zone. That it was not the last phase of such expansion became clear as the 20th century unfolded. The subordinated peoples, forcibly introduced to European economic and cultural systems by imperialism, came to see a need for modernizing and industrializing their own countries, and for using the methods or resources of European science, technology, and capital. But they wished to get rid of imperialists, govern themselves, and control the conditions under which modernization and borrowing should take place. In opposition to European empires, subject peoples began to assert their own cultural identities and also to draw upon influential European ideas that were flowing throughout the modern world. Ideas of liberty and democracy, and of an anti-capitalism that passed easily into socialism. Many such ideas were derived from the French and American revolutions, or from Marxism, or from the whole modern history of Europe itself. But these ideas were also transformed or challenged as they entered into and interacted with the political and cultural traditions of other civilizations. Imperialism. The present chapter deals only with the imperialist phase of this global transformation. By one of the ironies of history, the imperialist rivalries of the European powers, while representing Europe's global dominance, also contributed to the disaster of the First World War, and so to the collapse of such political and economic supremacy as Europe had enjoyed. 658-75. Imperialism, its nature and causes. 1167. European civilization had shown a strong tendency to expand since the early medieval era. In the Middle Ages, Latin Christendom spread by conquest and conversion to include the whole area from Spain to Finland, and Christian crusaders had even for a time controlled territories amid the mostly Muslim lands of the Middle East. Then came the age of overseas discoveries and the founding of early modern colonial empires, whose expansion and conflicts affected the balance of power within Europe throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and whose most far-reaching consequences included large-scale European immigration and the gradual Europeanization of societies and cultures in most of the Americas. At the same time, European culture spread among the upper classes of Russia. The final defeat of Napoleon in 1815, however, left only one of the old colonial empires standing in any strength, namely, the British. For 60 years after the Napoleonic Wars, there were no significant colonial rivalries among the major European powers. In many circles, there was an indifference to overseas empires. Under principles of free trade, it was thought unnecessary to exercise political influence in areas in which one did business. During these years, however, the French took control of Algeria, the British strengthened their Indian Empire, the Dutch developed Java and the neighboring islands more intensively, and the Western powers opened Japan and began to move into the coastal territories of China. Among these various colonial interventions, the French occupation of Algeria may have had the most significant influence within a European society. The French army waged a series of brutal military campaigns in the 1830s and 1840s to suppress strong Muslim opposition to colonization, and a stream of immigrants began to flow from France into the Algerian towns and countryside that the army gradually brought under French control. Napoleon III viewed France's expansion across North Africa as another opportunity to demonstrate his own imperial grandeur, which he asserted in the course of two highly publicized trips to Algeria during the 1860s. But the French conquest of Algeria and the development of European colonies in Asia did not lead to overt imperial conflicts among Europeans, and there was no systematic imperial program, doctrine, or ism. 1168, rather suddenly, about 1870 or 1880, colonial questions came again to the fore, driven in part by the rising power of the recently consolidated German Empire and French reactions to the loss of Alsace and Lorraine after the Franco-Prussian War. In this short space of 2 decades, by 1900, the advanced industrial countries partitioned most of the earth among themselves. A world map by 1900 showed their colonial possessions in some 9 or 10 colors, stretching widely across Asia, Africa, and islands in every ocean. 659 production, and often imported enslaved labor, especially in the then booming sugar islands of the West Indies. New imperialism versus old colonialism. The new imperialism changed the earlier patterns of European economic and political involvements in Asia and Africa. Europeans were no longer content simply to purchase what local workers and merchants provided. They wanted goods of a kind or in a quantity that pre-industrial 1169, the new imperialism. The new imperialism differed both economically and politically from the colonialism of earlier times. The older empires had been maritime and mercantile. European traders in India, Java, or South China had simply purchased the wares brought to them by local merchants or commercial agents, and as produced by the local organization of labor and by local technologies. They operated on a kind of cash and carry basis. European governments had few direct territorial ambitions in Asia beyond the protection of way stations and trading centers. To these generalizations, America, the Philippines, and Australia had been exceptions. The societies in these areas of the world had neither native states that Europeans respected, nor native industries in which Europeans were interested. Europeans had therefore developed territorial claims, invested capital, brought in their own methods of handicraft methods could not supply. They moved into the poorest and least industrialized countries more thoroughly. They invested capital in them, setting up mines, plantations, docks, warehouses, factories, refineries, railroads, river steamships, and banks. They built offices, homes, hotels, clubs, and cool mountain resorts for European officials and visitors. Taking over the productive economic life of the country, they transformed large elements of the local population into the wage employees of foreign owners, and so introduced the class relations and problems of industrial Europe in a form accentuated by racial differences. Or they lent money to non-European rulers, the Khedive of Egypt, the Shah of Persia, the Emperor of China, to enable them to hold up their tottering thrones or simply to live with more pleasure and magnificence than they could from their usual revenues. Europeans thus developed a huge financial stake in governments and economic enterprises outside their own nations and commercial networks within Europe. To secure these investments, and for other reasons, in contrast to what had happened under the older colonialism, the Europeans now aspired to political and territorial domination. Some areas became outright colonies, directly governed by European states and their appointed government officials. Others became protectorates. Here, the native chief, sultan, bey, raja, or prince was maintained and protected against internal upheaval or external conquest. A European resident or commissioner usually told him what to do, thereby safeguarding European interests through a kind of indirect rule. In other regions, as in China or Persia, where no single European state could make good its claims against the others, they arranged to divide the country into spheres of influence, each European power having advisory privileges and investment and trade opportunities within its own sphere. The sphere of influence was the vaguest of all forms of imperial control. Supposedly, it left the country independent, but each sphere of outside influence undermined the sovereignty or local power of the state in which it was established. Political and territorial domination, 1170. An enormous differential opened up about 1875 between the power of European and non-European states. Queen Elizabeth had dealt with the great mogul of the Indian subcontinent with genuine respect, at least in part because his revenues in the early 17th century were some 20 times greater than those of the English monarchy. Even Napoleon had pretended to regard the Shah of Persia as an equal. Then came the Industrial Revolution in Europe, iron and steel ships, heavier naval guns, and more accurate rifles. Democratic and nationalist movements produced large states and unified European peoples who gave service and financial support to their governments. Seemingly endless wealth with modern administration allowed European governments to tax, borrow, and spend without apparent limit. The modern nation-states loomed as enormous power complexes without precedent in the world's history. At the same time, it so happened that all the principal non-European empires were internally divided or falling into political decay. They were receiving a minimum of support from their own subjects. As in the 18th century, when the disintegration of the Mughal Empire had enabled the British to take over India. So, in the 19th century, the political weakness and vulnerabilities of the Sultan of Turkey, the Sultan of Zanzibar, the Shah of Persia, the Emperor of China, and the Shogun of Japan made European intervention remarkably easy. Only the Japanese were 660 able to revolutionize their government in time to ward off imperialist penetration. Even the Japanese, however, were restricted by early treaties that controlled their tariff policies until after 1900. 1171 European access to colonial territories in the period of the New Imperialism often depended on the construction of new railroads, which carried both people and goods into and out of the interior districts of the European colonies. This picture portrays the arrival of a locomotive that a team of elephants pulled into central India when a new railroad track was built in the region of Indore during the 1870s. Getty Images. So great was the difference in the sheer mechanics of power during this era that a mere show of force usually allowed the Europeans to impose their will. A garrison of only 75,000 troops long held India for the British. Numerous sporadic little wars were constantly fought: Afghan wars, Burmese wars, Zulu wars, which affected local populations but which passed unnoticed by Europeans in the home country. Such wars might be compared to the violent operations of the United States Army against the Indians of the Western Plains, but they did not become national military mobilizations or total wars that affected most national citizens. The Spanish-American War of 1898 and the Boer War of 1899 were also wars of colonial type, fought between entirely unequal parties. Often a show of naval strength was enough to gain European control over a new territory. It was the classic age of the punitive bombardment. In 1856, the British consul at Guangzhou, to punish acts of violence against Europeans in southern China, called upon the local British admiral to bombard that Chinese city. In 1863, the British bombarded the Japanese province of Satsuma, and in 1864, an Allied force, including Americans, bombarded Choshu, precipitating revolution in Japan. Similarly, 1172 Alexandria was bombarded in 1882, and Zanzibar in 1896. The usual consequence of such gunboat diplomacy was that the local ruler signed a treaty, reorganized the government, or accepted a European, usually British, advisor. Europeans imposed their will, 661 incentives and motives. Behind the new imperial aggressiveness lay many pressures and motives. The Europeans could not maintain for themselves the style of life to which they had become accustomed, except by bringing the rest of the world and its resources within their economic orbit. But many other cultural and social concerns also drove Europeans into distant, unknown places. Catholic and Protestant groups sent growing numbers of missionaries to remote regions where they sometimes got into trouble with the local people and where some missionaries were even killed. Public opinion in the home countries, soon learning of such events by ocean cable, might clamor for political action to suppress such outbreaks of anti-Christian violence. Similarly, scientists required geographical expeditions for their observations and discoveries. Wealthy Europeans traveled more now that travel was so easy. They hunted tigers or elephants or simply went to see the sights. It seemed only reasonable to Europeans at the close of the 19th century that all Europeans, wherever they might choose to go, should enjoy the personal security and the orderly legal procedures that colonial governments sought to provide for the Europeans who visited or lived in their overseas empires. Economically, European life required material goods, many of which only tropical regions could supply. Even the working classes now drank tea or coffee every day. After the American Civil War, Europe relied for its cotton increasingly on Africa and the East. Rubber and petroleum became staple needs. The lowly jute, which grew only in India, was used 1173 to make burlap, twine, carpets, and the millions of jute bags employed in commerce. The lordly coconut tree had innumerable common uses, which led to its intensive cultivation in the Dutch Indies. Various parts of it could be eaten or manufactured into bags, brushes, cables, rope, sails, or doormats, or converted into coconut oil, which in turn went into the making of candles, soap, margarine, and many other products. Raw materials. Neo-mercantilism 1174. Industrial countries also attempted to sell their own products, and the most fervent imperialists often emphasized the urgent necessity of finding new overseas markets. The rapid industrialization of Germany, the United States, Japan, and other countries led to new economic competition among these countries and with Great Britain for foreign trade. A slow decline in prices after 1873 meant that a business firm had to sell more goods to turn over the same amount of money. The advanced industrial countries, as we have seen, responded to this commercial challenge by raising tariffs to keep out each other's products. It was therefore argued that each industrialized nation must develop a colonial empire, an area of sheltered markets, as the phrase went in England, in which the home country would supply manufactured goods in return for raw materials. The idea was to create a large self-sufficient trading unit, embracing various climates and types of resources, protected if necessary from outside competition by tariffs, guaranteeing a market for all its members and wealth and prosperity for the home country. This phase of imperialism is often called neo-mercantilism because it revived in substance the mercantilism, or national economic systems, of the 16th to the 18th centuries. Purely financial considerations also characterized the new European imperialism. Money invested in poorer, less industrialized countries by the close of the 19th century brought a higher rate of return than if invested in the more industrialized ones. For this, there were many reasons, including the cheap cost of labor in non-European regions, the heavy and unsatisfied demand for non-European products in wealthier countries, and the greater risk of losses in areas where European ideas of law and order did not prevail. By 1900, Western Europe 662, the profit motive 1175, and the northeastern United States were equipped with their basic industrial apparatus. Their railway networks and first factories had become well established. Opportunities for investment in these countries were more stable, but less likely to produce the highest possible profits. At the same time, these countries were accumulating capital that was available for new investments. In the mid-century, most exported capital was British-owned. By the close of the century, more French, German, American, Dutch, Belgian, and Swiss investors were investing or lending outside their own borders. In 1850, most exported capital went to build up Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, or Argentina. By 1900, more of it was going to undeveloped regions in other parts of the world. This capital was the property of individual small savers or of large banking combinations. Investors in Europe and North America preferred to see European political control over the parts of Asia, Africa, or Latin America in which their railroads, mines, plantations, government loans, or other investments were situated. Hence, the profit motive, or desire to invest surplus capital, promoted imperialism. Europeans often described their colonial empires as systems that advanced a civilizing mission. This mission consisted, in the European view, mainly of promoting European methods of education, commerce, labor, and legal justice, all of which provoked both resistance and adaptations among colonized peoples. This image portrays an African leader signing a treaty with French officials who would have been looking for French privileges and economic opportunities in the surrounding lands and in the community of people that was observing this event. Prisma, Getty Images. This analysis was put forward by critics of the global economic system, such as the English socialist J.A. Hobson, who wrote an influential book on imperialism in 1903, and later by Lenin in his 663 1176 Imperialism, the Highest Stage of World Capitalism, written in 1916. They ascribed imperialism primarily to the economic need for profitable investments of surplus capital and condemned it on socialist grounds. Hobson argued that a change in the domestic economy of the industrialized nations would remove the main motive for imperialism. If more of the national income went to workers as wages and less of it to capitalists as interest and dividends, or if wealthy people were more heavily taxed and the money used for social welfare, there would be no surplus of capital and no economic rationale for imperialism. Because the working class, if this were done, would also have more purchasing power, it would be less necessary to look endlessly for new markets outside the country. But the surplus capital explanation of imperialism was not entirely convincing. That investors and exporters were instrumental in the rise of imperialism was very true, and yet it was more doubtful that imperialism arose essentially from the capitalists' pressure to invest abroad. Perhaps even more basic was Europe's need for imports. Only by enormous imports could Europe sustain its dense population, complex industry, and high standard of living. It was the demand for such imports cotton, cocoa, coffee, copper, and the like drawn from the colonies that made investment in the colonies financially profitable. Moreover, non Europeans themselves often sought European capital, glad though the European lenders were to lend it at high rates. In 1890, this might mean merely that a Shah or Sultan wanted to build himself a new palace, but the need of non Europeans for Western capital was basic, nor was it to decline in later times. Lastly, the imperialism of some countries, notably Russia and Italy, which had little capital and few modern type capitalists of their own, could not reasonably be attributed to pressure for lucrative foreign investments. Socialist Critics 1177. For the British, however, the capitalistic incentive was of great importance. We have seen how the British in 1914 had $20 billion invested outside Great Britain, a quarter of all their wealth. About half, or $10 billion, was invested in the British Empire. Only a tenth of French foreign investments was in French colonies. French investment in the colonial world in general, however, including Egypt, Suez, South Africa, and Asia, in addition to the French colonies, amounted to about a fifth of all French foreign investments. Only an infinitesimal fraction of German foreign investment in 1914 was in German colonies, which were of slight economic value. A fifth of German foreign investments, however, was placed in Africa, Asia, and the Ottoman Empire. These sums are enough to suggest the economic pressures upon the European governments to assert political influence in Africa, Turkey, or China. In addition, French investors had in 1914 a huge stake in the Russian Empire. Russia, an imperial power with respect to adjoining countries in the Balkans and Asia, occupied an almost semi-colonial status with respect to Western Europe. The Tsardom until its demise in 1917, not unlike the Ottoman Sultanate or the Qing dynasty in China, increasingly depended on foreign loans, predominantly French. The French in 1914 had lent over $2 billion to Russia, more than to all colonial regions combined. For these huge outlays, the motivation was at least as much political as economic. The French government urged French banks to buy Russian bonds. The aim was not merely to make a profit for bankers and small investors, but to build up and hold together a military ally against Germany. Foreign economic interests in Russia. Joseph Chamberlain, 664-1178. Politics went along with economics in the whole process of imperialist expansion. National security, both political and economic, was as important for the advocates of imperialism as the accumulation of private wealth. So too was the growing concern in many quarters over the economic security and welfare of the working classes. The ideas of the British statesman Joseph Chamberlain, 1836 to 1914, illustrated how these motives entered into imperialist thinking. Chamberlain, father of Neville Chamberlain, who was to be Prime Minister of Britain in the years just prior to the Second World War, began as a Birmingham manufacturer, the type of man who a generation before would have been a staunch free trader and upholder of laissez-faire. Discarding the old individualism, he came to believe that the national community should and could take better care of its members, and that the British community, or empire, could advance the welfare of Britons. As mayor of Birmingham, he introduced a kind of municipal socialism, including public ownership of utilities. As colonial secretary from 1895 to 1903, he preached Britain's need for a great self-sustaining and self-protecting empire in an age of rising international competition, a worldwide British trading area developed by British capital, which would give a secure source of raw materials and food, markets for exports, and a steady level of profits, wages, and employment. Chamberlain was thus concerned about the movement toward political independence in Canada, New Zealand, and the Australian Commonwealth. For these dominions, he favored complete self-government, but he hoped that, once assured of their own political autonomy, they would reknit their ties with each other and with Great Britain. Britain and its dominions, in Chamberlain's view, should pool their resources for economic well-being as well as for military defense. The Dominions had already levied tariffs against British manufacturers in order to build up their own. Chamberlain urged the Dominions to charge a lower duty on British wares than on the same wares coming from foreign countries. In return, he even proposed that Great Britain adopt a protective tariff so that it might then favor Canadian or Australian goods by offering them a lower rate. His plan was to bind the empire together through a kind of global tariff union, or system of imperial preference. Because Britain imported mainly meat and cereals from the Dominions, Chamberlain was obliged to recommend a tariff even upon these products, to tax the people's food, repudiating the core principle of free trade upon which the British economy had rested for half a century. The proposal was rejected. Chamberlain died in 1914, his goal unaccomplished. But after the First World War, the British Empire, or Commonwealth of Nations, followed closely the proposals he had mapped out. Whether the economic welfare and security of the European working classes was advanced by imperialism is still debated. It is probable that the worker in Western Europe did gain some economic benefits from imperialism. Socially conservative imperialists were joined in this belief by thinkers of the extreme left. Marx himself, followed by Lenin, thought that the European worker obtained higher real wages through the inflow of low-priced colonial goods and commodities. To Marxists, this was 1179 unfortunate, for it gave European workers a vested interest in imperialism, made the European proletariat opportunistic, i.e., unrevolutionary, and blocked the formation of a united world proletariat of all races. Working classes and imperialism. Another imperialist argument, much heard at the time, held that European countries must acquire colonies to which surplus population could migrate without altogether abandoning the native land. It seemed unfortunate, for example, that so many Germans or Italians emigrating to the United States should be lost to the fatherland. This argument was purely specious. No European country after 1870 acquired any colony to which European families in any numbers wished to move. The millions who were still leaving Europe continued to go mainly to the Americas, where new European colonies could not be founded. The competitive nature of the European state system introduced other almost exclusively political features to the new imperialism. The European states sought constantly to guard their security against each other. They wanted to keep some kind of balance among themselves, in the overseas world as in Europe. Hence, as in the scramble for Africa, one government often hurriedly annexed territory simply for fear that another might do so. 1665 Diplomacy and Imperialism, 1180 first. Or again, colonies came to have an intangible but momentous value in symbolism and prestige. To have colonies was a criterion of national greatness. It was the sign of having arrived as a great power. Britain and France had held colonies for centuries. Therefore, the new powers that emerged after the 1860s, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United States, came to believe they had to have colonies also. This photograph of Indian servants bringing tea to British officials suggests the social hierarchy and the pattern of cross-cultural relations in colonial India at the end of the 19th century. Popper photo, Getty Images. Imperialism as crusade. Imperialism arose from the commercial, industrial, financial, scientific, political, journalistic, intellectual, religious, and humanitarian impulses of Europe compounded together. It was a new outward expansion of the modern European states, economies, and cultures that had forcefully asserted their power and influence around the world for almost 4 centuries. And its advocates claimed that European colonialism would bring civilization and enlightenment to those who still sat in darkness. Faith in modern civilization had become a kind of substitute religion. Imperialism was its crusade. So the British spoke of the white man's burden, the French of their mission civilisatrice, the Germans of diffusing culture, the Americans of the blessings of Anglo-Saxon 666 protection. Social Darwinism and popular anthropology taught the racist doctrine that the white races were fitter or more gifted than the peoples of other races. Some imperialists gave less emphasis to race as a 1181 rationale for empires, turning instead to cultural justifications for the colonization of distant peoples and societies. They argued that the backwardness of non European societies was due to historic and hence temporary causes, but that for a long period into the future, the more civilized Europeans must keep a guardianship over their darker proteges. The psychology of imperialism contained strands of idealism and humanitarianism, as well as greed, and numerous Europeans went to the colonies to build schools or hospitals rather than railroads or mines. Young people of good family left the pleasant lands of Devonshire or Poitou to spend long and lonely years in hot, isolated places, sustained by the thought that they were advancing the work of humanity. They saw their colonial labors as contributions to a humanitarian campaign to spread modern education, to put down slave raiding, torture, and famine, to combat degrading superstitions, to fight the diseases of neglect and filth, and to promote the ideas and institutions of legal justice, even though colonial legal systems did not treat the colonizers and native people in the same way. But these accomplishments, however real, went along all too obviously with European self-interest and were expressed with unbearable complacency and gross condescension to other cultures and the larger part of the global human population. As Rudyard Kipling wrote in 1899, in his exhortation to Americans after their taking over of the Philippines, Trade Missions 1182, "Take up the white man's burden. Send out the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Responding to such demeaning ideas and to the imperial interventions that they encouraged, the colonized peoples in Asia and Africa would soon launch anti-colonial movements that reshaped modern global history and also changed the views of imperialism within Europe itself. During the decades of new imperial expansion before 1914, however, people living in the newly colonized societies were generally unable to resist the European powers or to counter the popular fusion of nationalism and imperialism in most European cultures. Imperialism thus repeated similar themes and practices throughout the modern world, but we must now discuss some regional examples to see how the European ascendancy evolved somewhat differently in specific places, conflicts, and cross-cultural exchanges.